Hi, once again I'm Sydney and I am a servant of the Almighty God. As has to be customary, I have to always start this with the reminder that we are always in the presence of the living God. So unlike things that look at thousands of years ago or whatever, we have to remember we are always in the presence of the living God. I am also the author of my latest book, The Thesis, Life's Logic Module, and also a few other books. There's also Humanity's Inflection Point. These here are my guiding principles. These are messages that I received many years ago. And so this episode, it's actually a two-part, so I'll do this in two parts. This is the first part. In this episode, I want to talk about what the original evolutionists got wrong and why they got it wrong. Okay, in the second part, I'll talk about the current evolutionists and what they totally, again, get wrong. So if you go back to the great work of Charles Darwin, he spent a lot of time, put a lot of effort and dedication into recognizing what he wrote as to the evolution of species by means of natural selection. The one thing that was missed back then, and this, once we discovered DNA and that kind of helped them fill out the tree, and how it came from this primordial soup and spread everywhere, there is some fundamental principles that people who are involved in design and building would recognize these principles. And evidently these, you have people who are involved in theories, but if you don't actually do the work, you may not be familiar with some of the principles involved in design and building. So there are a couple things that people who design and build are aware of, and they are reusability. And when you design, you'll also have, so basically three things, right? It's three principles. You have to look at reusability, you think about interoperability, and you also always have to be aware of scope. Scope is basically the boundaries. When you design something, a car, it drives on the road. It doesn't drive in water, it doesn't fly. So you look at the scope of your design. My design is supposed to do this. But one of the biggest things is reusability. Anyone involved in any kind of building or design, I'm sure you're familiar with that saying, don't reinvent the wheel. Although, occasionally it's good to take a look and see, with the passage of time, maybe there's somewhere we can improve these things. But it's that basic thing of don't reinvent the wheel, so you reuse. The original, and even, with the advent of DNA, what we can recognize is reusability. As I go into quite a bit of detail in my latest book, The Thesis, Life's Logic Module, what you recognize is reusability. You see DNA being reused everywhere. We see the sensors that make up the sensory system. The elements of the sensory system are reused everywhere. And that's just elegant design. You see, we don't look at a lawnmower and say, well, it has wheels and it has a little engine, and then we look at a sports car and say, oh, that sports car came out of that lawnmower. It evolved from this sports car, or one of these monster trucks evolved out of this lawnmower. We don't do that. What we see is reusability. So with DNA, just like we do with chips, right? Nobody goes and rebuilds a GPS sensor. A lot of those chips are built by the same company. We reuse those things. So people who designed and build stuff are very familiar with reusability. So we don't just automatically look and say, oh, this is everywhere. Although, Charles Darwin wasn't familiar with DNA and all of that stuff. But he proposed, based on observing the outside, and I'll get into that in the second session. I'll get into, what is completely missed, something that is so, intrinsic, something that is so fundamental to all of these things. But so these people anyone who goes out and observes stuff and comes back and says, well, I see this and this and this. So this, no, what you're seeing is reusability. And that brings me to, interoperability. Now, we are pushing that, right? We can see where, with gene splicing and even using organs from different animals, there is some interoperability. But there is a scope. Scope is the boundaries to which this design fits. So it will not exceed these boundaries. So when you design something, you say, no, it's going to look like this and this. You can have interoperability. You can have parts that you can reuse, blood between people. So we have some interoperability. We have a lot of reusability. Now, one of the things that shows that even with reusability and interoperability, there is scope, is that we know by looking at the genome that we are like 98%, or the chimpanzees and us share like 98% of the genetic code, but there is a scope. We cannot overlap. That is designed. If these things were random, we could interoperate. We could have crossbreeding between chimpanzees and us because we're that close. We don't see that with butterflies. We don't see that with any animal out there. And the animals, based on intelligence, they know that. They say, well, yes, but dogs and wolves, they are basically, very, very close. But if you look at butterflies, bees, they don't go about saying, well, I'm confused, I'm going to go try to interbreed with something. That intelligence within them, the yeasts that I talk about, is able to distinguish. It monitors all the senses, so it sees it, hears it, and that keeps the scope. But the scope is not just, like an intelligence thing. It's hardwired. This is why we can't, just take this butterfly and say, okay, mix it with this one. We can't do that. It just won't work because there is a defined scope. Now, this thing about reusability, when we look at the senses, right? Everything has sensory systems. Every living thing has sensory systems. So the ability to detect temperature and pressure and light and all of these things, so many things have. These are components of the sensory system that are reused. One of the very interesting things is, if you look at, there are some, for instance, there may be some animals that have these, like bats, they have the ability to detect, things that are beyond the visible spectrum. Similarly, we would see in fishes and different animals have these special senses, like being able to detect the life force or whatever little electrical energy is given off by their prey. But what we don't see is that in this hypothetical evolutionary tree, we don't see that everything on this branch having the same senses. And if you think about it, if things did flow along that way, you would find that everything in this branch has, that's derived from something else, right? Because you can't go to the end of the tree and say, okay, it just came in new. It's like, no, this, as you are derived, in theory, you are more advanced, you would keep those great, those qualities or these attributes that are essential or beneficial. We don't see that. So this is where we see reusability, but nothing is derived from something else. So this is But this again is a flaw of people who don't design. They observe and they report well and they make these associations, but with our current knowledge, we are seeing these disruptions because we should be seeing these halves, right? We should see where this is transitioning into something else. We never see that. There is no record in the archaeological, history of any of these half species migrating. What we see are distinct. Now, within that, we see evolution. We see the ability to adapt. This is what I call intelligent adaptation. Not, and this, as opposed to natural selection, we see this intelligent adaptation to elements in the environment. Anything that can pose an existential threat, the ability to adapt, like when we, and I talked about this in the book, those Bajau, people who spend so much time in the sea and their spleen expanded so they can hold more oxygen. This is an intelligent adaptation. So the original evolutionists, they saw all of these things and they made this connection because they did not recognize reusability and also the scope. Things like, looking at genetically, they're very close, but why don't they mix? Because there is an intelligently defined scope to each of these elements or, organisms out there. There is a scope defined. This is an intelligent purpose. And so what they've done is they observe things, and unfortunately, it's like a bureaucracy, right? Once it's created, it perpetuates itself. And so to terminate that and replace it with, and in my second thing I'll get into a lot more into why we need to replace this, is that the original guys, they made this error of not knowing or not recognizing the reusability and the scope, because they saw some interoperability. They said, well, this can go into this, and this is derived from this. But the fact that we have never found any halves, that theoretical missing link, we can't find it between any two species. So that is completely, is completely absent, which shows that yes, species can evolve, but they are not derived from each other. And again, like I said, when I get into the second part of this, we will see there's even a bigger component that's completely ignored. But the original guys not having the concept of that reusability, even though there is interoperability, because when we look at our vehicles, right, computers, there is so much. As we become much more intelligent, we've become much more knowledgeable. We can build. Now we're actually getting into AI, and we're building, intelligence. We can see this. Interoperability is a big thing. Reusability is almost fundamental to intelligent design. But there's always a scope. We don't take the wheels out of some lawnmower and put it on a car. They all may have, different vehicles have different transmissions, and some things, there are a lot of, nuts and bolts that are interoperable. Some things may even be reusable. I mean, you can take an engine, and as long as the engine bay will hold it, you can change things around and put a bigger engine. You could do things. That's reusability and some interoperability. But there's a scope to things. We don't take an engine from, some people might try, from a car and put it on a lawnmower. We have large trucks. Again, there's a scope even to our design. This is designed for this, and not just with engines. With chips. We don't take things from a refrigerator, even though we can have interoperable things. GPS is becoming, it's everywhere now, right? It's ubiquitous, and so we can have that interoperability. But recognizing that, we will take a step back and we will not simply assume that this is derived from something else just because they have these things in common. We can recognize that this may be reusability at work, which is another indicator of intelligent design. So I want to thank you for taking the time to review this, and got to look at the second part of this. Okay, so you will see how not only in the past has these evolutionists made these real errors that has led us down this path, and now as a bureaucracy it becomes self-sustaining, because most people you talk with, and you hear it all the time, and I have to make this point. Most people will say nature, and anyone who says nature did this or nature is responsible is someone who does not understand. They haven't taken the time to really research this, because nature does not do anything. Nature is the place where all these things that have been, they are so equipped that they were naturally selected, where they all exist. So when we step outside with all the trees and the animals, that is nature. It's the place. It does not actually perform any action. So whenever someone says, well, nature gave us this, you recognize, okay, this person is just carrying on a story. It's kind of like parroting what they've heard. Because anyone who delve a little bit, just put it in any AI engine, you will see nature does not do anything. Nature is the place where all these things reside. Okay, so we have to look at the processes, and anyone looking at that and recognizing the reusability, the interoperability, and the scope would recognize intelligent design. Okay, again, I want to thank you for taking the time. It's not any coincidence that you're seeing this. This is to enlighten. This is something to make you think, not just go around parroting things. Okay, so again, I want you to take the time and review the second part of this, and thank you again, and until, may God bless us all. Thank you.